Hello everyone, it's Jabara here. Today's video is a patron request. If you'd like to make a video request of your own, you can do so by becoming a patron. The link to this can be found below. Warfare is an unfortunate reality of human existence, or as Albert Einstein puts it, so as long as there are men, there will be war. Despite our innate obsession with warfare and our tendency to romanticize it, the reality is, warfare is almost always caused by the selfish ambitions of one group over another, whether it be for purposes of monopolizing local resources, controlling trade routes, or fully annexing or establishing vassalage over the belligerent group altogether. Emphasis of wars of Sub-Saharan Africa is largely ignored as insignificant and is usually shut off as tribal warfare. The only African wars that receive any sort of media coverage are modern civil wars and genocides that have cropped up after ethnic tensions which were stirred up after the colonization of Africa. But anyway, that's a topic for an entirely separate video. Pre-colonial Sub-Saharan African arms, armor, wars, and military strategies are a topic that is largely unknown or discussed in modern media or academia, and sources for it are few and far between. However, in this video, I will attempt to bring some of these interesting, complex, and largely ignored aspects of African military history out of the shadows, and reconstruct some of the epic wars and battle tactics of Sub-Saharan Africans in pre-colonial times. Historically, West Africa has been the most ethnically diverse and one of the most densely populated regions in not just Africa, but the entire world. As a result, ethnic tension has been a fact of life throughout much of its history in comparison to other regions of the African continent. Just as the region is ethnically diverse, it is also geographically diverse, with dense rainforests to the south, arid deserts to the north, and vast grasslands in between. This diversity in geographical distribution inevitably leads to sharp contrasts in the military practices and strategies of West African peoples. Contrary to wars in Europe or the Middle East, large-scale engagements in which armies numbering in the tens of thousands pitched battles in an open field against one another, the dense forests of West Africa bred a different style of warfare. Armies of the West African forest kingdoms were typically divided into several smaller units, separated by large distances rather than one large battle formation. In fact, a slave who formerly commanded a unit of 3,000 troops told Monrovian missionary George Christian Oldendorp that his army spanned 3 kilometers on the march. 3,000 is a relatively small number, so a column of perhaps 30,000 soldiers would have extended over 30 kilometers in respect to the column described by the former commander in question. When armies reach those sizes, however, it's much more likely that they advance in several columns and converge in one rendezvous point if auxiliary troops were needed. Communication could be maintained despite these vast distances, utilizing an indigenous instrument. These instruments, known as talking drums, contained adjustable leather straps that could change the tone that they emitted when struck. West African languages, being largely tonal, could be mimicked by the tones of these drums, thus allowing troops to communicate with one another from several miles away by conveying tonal messages with these instruments. This type of long-distance organization was of paramount importance due to the sheer nature of fighting in the dense brush. Leading large armies in one massive group through dense forests would easily become a recipe for confusion, disorganization, and ultimately, disaster. This led to relatively smaller engagements and guerrilla warfare despite having large fighting forces. This is not to say, however, that large-scale battles never happened in West African forests, because they did, but not in the way that one might expect. They had to be specifically orchestrated and pitched by belligerents on both sides. This wasn't as simple as meeting in a grassland or open field as was done in Europe or the Middle East. It was much more complicated than that. The conflicts that took place between the Akyem and Ashanti kingdoms in the 18th century provide excellent examples of West African forest warfare. One war was fought in 1741 between the two kingdoms for nearly a year. They fought in a series of small skirmishes following the pattern formerly described, before finally deciding to commit to a full-scale battle. Both sides agreed to employ 10,000 men each to cut down forests and clear out an area large enough to accommodate their troops for war. In doing this, they quite literally created a battlefield. This war resulted in the decisive defeat of the Kingdom of Akyem by the Ashanti in 1742, which shouldn't come as a surprise, as the Ashanti had the most powerful military in the region during that time. As with all other wars, having knowledge of local terrain also played a major role in the outcome of forest battles. An 18th century ruler of the small state of Wassa named Nsitful was a shining example of this, as he was regarded as having expert knowledge of utilizing the forest to gain an upper hand over his enemies. He managed to lead his army into the forest on several occasions, escaping from overwhelming forces of Ashanti warriors that would have otherwise wiped out his military. He was also known to have controlled roads by occupying key positions, much to the dismay of the Ashanti. Nsifo was known far and wide throughout the Kingdom of Akyem for his cunning skills. They recalled the fact that he was able to fight the Ashanti for 20 years with just 2,000 men. In fact, prior to the forest battle previously shown, Akyem's leaders tried to convince their king Bakwante to deploy a 100,000 man raid on the Ashanti Empire, utilizing Nsifo's strategies. Unfortunately for the Kingdom of Akyem, the suggestions were declined, and as mentioned before, they were crushed by the Ashanti army. The forest made warfare a much slower and more drawn-out process than wars fought in open battlefields. It was typical for forest kingdoms to amass large armies and ready them for battle, yet no actual combat would take place for several months. In February of 1717, the Ashanti declared war on the Akyem kingdom. Yet no definitive battle even took place until the months of September and October, when the Ashanti attacked the Akyem by marching through the neighboring neutral Akwamu kingdom. This strategy would have taken the Akyem by surprise and would have devastated their forces, but the seemingly neutral Akwamu warned them about the advance of the encroaching Ashanti army, allowing them to meet the Ashanti in battle and lay siege to their detachment. Eventually, food and supplies began to wane within the surrounded Ashanti force, and a smallpox outbreak finished the job, allowing the surrounding Akyem forces to attack and defeat the severely weakened and impoverished Ashanti army. In 1764, the Ashanti utilized this same method on the Akyem kingdom themselves. As the Akyem army advanced, the Ashanti deployed 2 units for the sole purpose of blocking all positions of retreat and cutting them off from any routes that may lead them back to their allies from the Wassa kingdom. By the time the battle ensued, the Akyem army was literally on the brink of starvation. I'd also like to point out that the word siege does not quite do this type of strategy justice, as they were not proper sieges. No cities or towns were surrounded or defended. These battles took place in the dense brush of West Africa, where the men relied solely on the supplies that they took with them and whatever they could scrounge in the forest. This is a stark contrast to siege warfare, where a city can usually supply the army with food for a fairly sufficient amount of time before crumbling. This series of force campaigns made the Ashanti the dominant military force of the Gold Coast region. A complex network of roads were constructed throughout their newly carved empire, which were maintained daily by a massive local labor force, and kept the Ashanti kingdom's major cities, commercial centers, and military positions connected with one another. These roads also eliminated the need to march troops through forests anymore. This was similar to the campaigns led by the Roman Empire into the forests of Germania, where the lack of roads gave the Germanic tribes an edge over Roman legions. Nsifo lost his former advantage over the Ashanti, as his experience in battle rested in his skills in forest warfare. 19th century European travelers remarked upon the sophisticated networks of roads that the Ashanti had constructed, as they began to modernize the forested region of their nation and expand their influence farther north. Their influence and power would go on to extend north of the forest zones, well into the grasslands, where they conquered several horse-riding kingdoms and states within the region, even adopting horses themselves for some engagements. Though initially unfamiliar to the Ashanti, cavalry had dominated the grasslands for millennia. They never made it very far into the south, as the forest-dwelling insect known as the tsetse fly carried a disease that was deadly to horses. Stay tuned for part 2 of this video, where I'll be covering the armies of the African Savannah, who were largely composed of cavalry. Also remember that this video was a patron request. If you'd like to make a request of your own, you can do so by becoming a patron. The link can be found below in the description. Always remember, we don't come from nothing.